Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong and Orca Security. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead, but first I have just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to rewatch, share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live webinar today. If you have any questions, we'd like you to submit those using the Q&A tab on the right side of the screen. And that's where you will also find the chat tab, where we want you to engage with one another as well as with our speakers, because your comments can help direct the flow of today's conversation. I will also point out that if you expand the handouts tab, also on the right side of the screen, you'll find a copy of the Pulse Meter report. And this is going to be the main topic of conversation today, so feel free to download that to follow along. And finally, at the conclusion of our webinar, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. So our topic today is visibility across clouds. Is it a myth? And I'm joined today by John Alexander, Senior Director of Technical Product Marketing at Orca Security, and Dan Kirsch, Principal Analyst and Managing Director at Techstrong Research. Dan, John, thank you both so much for joining us. Dan, I'm going to let you take it away from here.
Great. Thanks, Cody. As Cody mentioned, today we're going to be talking about a pulse meter. The pulse meter is a series of flash polls that we at Techstrong Research conduct. So across these polls, we had more than 400 responses, and we really wanted to cue in on this idea of visibility and insights across different platforms and across clouds. And we shared this with the Techstrong Research audience, which is really focused on cloud native security, and digital transformation. So let me hand it over to John to introduce himself.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. So yeah, this will be great. I'm looking forward to going over some real data, some real poll stuff on cloud visibility. I'm John Alexander. I'm the Senior Director of Technical Marketing at Orca. Not much to talk, but I've got about over 12 years of experience on the industry side and over 10 years of experience in security on the Army Reserve side. So anyways, I'll let you go ahead and get started, Dan.
Yeah, I'm sure the Army Reserve has just a few security concerns and cyber concerns. All right, so let's dive into some of this data. So let's start with this idea. And so we don't need novel research to say that the cloud is here and that we're in the era of the cloud. We all know that. So one question we want to ask specifically is about serverless technology. And are you using serverless technology on more than one cloud provider? And about 60% said they are, and about 40% said they aren't. And what's interesting about this is, we wanted to cue in on the idea of serverless, not just multi-cloud in general, but focus on serverless. We've done studies on multi-cloud, and about 75% of people say that they're using multi-cloud. But it's interesting, not surprisingly, at least not surprisingly to me, fewer are taking a multi-cloud approach to serverless. John, any thoughts on this, or any how do you view serverless in terms of how do you define it?
Yeah, sounds good. So this is almost like a multi-pronged question, which I kind of like. It has a little bit of a serverless component and the multi-cloud component, and I'll talk a little bit about both. On the serverless side, I've actually never quite liked the word serverless itself because it can have a lot of meanings. But the way I look at it is you're basically using services. So if you're serverless, you still have to have code that executes, right? But most of the code are services on your cloud service provider side. So you're minimizing that little footprint of what you have to write. And then you might use 10 Azure or 10 AWS services, and even more, right? So it's kind of a swap for that. And so in some cases with security, you're swapping a little bit of the security over to the CSP. But also what's a little bit confusing is that some people have even told us, me, that hey, we don't need security. Serverless doesn't need security. There's nothing to protect, which is people that say that obviously don't know much about serverless. There is a lot to protect. We've written a couple of good blogs about the topic, a lot of material. And I'll kind of transition over to you a little bit and talk about a little bit security on the serverless side, Dan, and then I'll go ahead and add a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting about the idea of trusting your provider to give you all the security you need. Because I think that was the trend a few years ago. What I've seen is organizations are starting to understand security is either a shared responsibility at most, or it's really your responsibility. And we have to be careful with what we're calling security. I mean, if you're using a cloud provider, there's an expectation that their platform is secure. I mean, you're not seeing, there was a worry 10 years ago, and even today somewhat, with multi-tenant approaches that someone could horizontally go across the cloud. That's not the type of concerns that I think organizations that understand the cloud and serverless are concerned about. But in terms of your own environment, I think there's huge issues around serverless security, and so it frightens me a little bit.
I'll go over a few to spur up the conversation, but I can at least list 5 things that you've got to secure on the serverless side. One is you've got to have your platform has to be services aware. It has to understand the services of that cloud service provider and help you button up any holes on that front to be able to check things. You've got a lot of configuration stuff that you have to worry about. You're mainly worried about communication configuration. If something's set wrong, then you've got a hole, right? So you're talking to these services. You've got IAM again, when you've got to do all this approval, you're talking to these services again. So you've got to do all your services identity management. And then finally, with that, you have secrets that you have to store somewhere, because you have to manage all these keys and other things to get at the services. And if you just put them, if your developers aren't put them anywhere, they're some of them can be visible, and you have to have a platform that looks for all those secrets and make sure you're not doing something unsecure that way. So there's a lot to secure. So the people that say, hey, serverless, doesn't require any security, that's it's just wrong. So
it also takes a different way of approaching security. I mean, you gotta, serverless security it's very different than your on-premises security. So I think, some companies who really struggle are newer to the cloud and newer to serverless. So they're taking their old approaches, using their old tools, and applying them to the cloud. And that's where some of the trouble comes in, because you also need a level of automation and visibility. When you mentioned configurations, huge problem that, I mean, how many breaches are caused because of an innocent mistake in a misconfiguration? I mean, it's
right, exactly.
So that's always a worry of mine. It's sort of misconfigurations, and teams are so busy.
And also, all these technologies, there's no one better technology, right? It's not like you're going to go use, unless you have very specialized use case, you're not going to use serverless for everything. Every technology, containers, Kubernetes, they all have certain advantages and disadvantages. So I don't see anybody using one technology. I think the serverless is, the biggest benefit is cost, right? But then there's disadvantages, because you have to architect your applications a certain way. But it is kind of nice if you have, for certain things, if you just have to spawn it. They're really good for things that don't occur very often. So you can spawn up something, it'll go do its little thing, and then it'll spawn down, right? And just say, but you can use containers for that a little bit too. So you really have to do an assessment. And I don't think there's one technology that fits all when you do choose a technology like that.
Yeah, and I also don't think there's a platform. So everyone's concerned about cloud security as a concept, but when they're looking at different platforms, whether they're going to go serverless or whether they're going to move fully to cloud native onto a platform, I from research I've done, I haven't seen a big difference in the security of AWS or Azure or IBM is inherently better than another platform. Each vendor might have their own approach, but I don't think there's a lot of difference between those.
Right. And that kind of gets down to the idea when we talk a little bit about multi-cloud, and we've talked about, one approach. There's different approaches, but one, initially when people go onto certain cloud service provider, they'll look at the native cloud provider tools, which are in general pretty good. But then they don't realize if you're going to go multi-cloud, there's no incentive for any cloud service provider to do their tools really well on the other cloud service provider platforms. I've just not seen it, right? Maybe somebody else has. So, generally we think when you look at that, you've got to look at a vendor who really truly is committed to being multi-cloud and not just saying it like, oh, we're multi-cloud. And you really look, because it's painful if you do choose two providers, let's say Google Cloud and Azure, and you're mostly using Azure, for instance, but then you've got to do a lot of maneuvering just to use the other stuff. It's nice if you can use the same platform. Things map really well. So even though it's different, you can go, okay, we're securing IAM this way. We can kind of take a similar approach to securing IAM, in both clouds. So be careful when people say multi-cloud and just check, right?
Yeah, as an industry analyst, every December I make predictions. And for a number of years I predicted this will be the year of multi-cloud management, and it never really came to fruition. And part of it is the cloud vendor management tools are really good, and they understand their platforms really well. And then getting visibility across clouds is so difficult that I think rather than management of the clouds, we really are more into this visibility and observability across clouds, and rather than fine-grained management across clouds. It's a difficult. You're not going to get it from a vendor. The vendors are incentivized to keep you on their platform.
And there's so many things too, right? You've got containers, you've got Kubernetes, you've got serverless. So ultimately, the person buying a platform and a secure platform cares about what you support. So if you're multi-cloud and they're using Kubernetes and you don't support Kubernetes, or you only support Kubernetes in one or two clouds, well, you're not really multi-cloud, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's a difference between hybrid and multi, and different flavors of multi in terms of, do you have just totally independent divisions using different clouds, or which maybe that's multi-cloud, maybe that's just we use multiple platforms, or do you have applications and workloads and data that's interoperating between clouds?
Right.
Different approaches to multi-cloud. But obviously we're talking about serverless. So we want to know where people are in their journey of serverless. So we asked the audience, are you using serverless technology? So about half said yes. 14% said they've got no plans. But what I thought was interesting is it's on the roadmap for so many companies. So that no, but within a year is very little, which is interesting. Right. But you got a huge group of companies who say, yeah, serverless is absolutely on our roadmap. And you touched on that earlier in terms of cost and really getting on-demand services, quickly, spinning it up, spinning it down when needed. Any other thoughts on why serverless is has grown in the last couple of years, but is definitely on that roadmap for
I think the way I answer the roadmap piece, that 33%, is just that serverless is complicated, and it's another thing, right? So I think people are studying it. Like I remember when Docker came out, right? I want to say circa, what was it, about 2013 when it started really getting hot. And it took people time. It took a year to assess the technology to see if you really wanted to do it. It just didn't start overnight. So I think the same thing is happening with serverless. And then I think the people that are really looking at it are kind of like saying, hey, this is really good for certain things, or they're trying to figure out, hey, how can I architect, this to do part of my business, right? And I think people are finding out that there is complexity around it. And it's not just about the complexity of implementing it, but on the security side. So like for us, if you don't really understand serverless on the security side, you don't see the serverless stuff. You don't understand Lambda or all the different ones, and you can't do compliance testing against that stuff, because believe me or not, a lot of the CIS standards have a lot of the coverage around serverless that's kind of built in. It's a little spread around. There's no serverless CIS policy, but there's a lot of, it's all kind of built in. And we kind of pull that in and be able to take a look at it. And you can kind of get a good view. But if the security vendor hasn't looked at serverless, then you're not really protecting serverless.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You bring up compliance and auditing. I mean, you can't audit what you don't see. So that's a big problem.
Yes.
And it takes the auditors a little time to catch up with newer technology sometimes.
Yeah, and we have that visibility. That's one of the cool things about the cloud, right? Is that this wasn't possible, not probably only about maybe 5 years ago that you could really go look at the inventory on the cloud and then being able to understand it. And I think it's not just getting the inventory, but then be able to make relationships between assets and things and really look at that inventory. But it's one of the nice things, if it's done right by a vendor, you can get 100% visibility. And one of the cool things about Orca, and I'm not going to talk too much about Orca, is that we're an agentless technology. So from the ground up, 100% visibility is something that we looked at. The technology was available when Orca started to do that. So that was nice.
Yeah, I mean, my love to hear more about sort of your thought of why agentless is important. My thought is, the cloud, your development teams are moving so quickly. Agent-based security almost goes against the requirement to quickly move, and setting up the environment can be challenging. Adding an agent is yet another step. So it slows things down. Yeah. What are sort of your thoughts in terms of differentiating why you might want to go with agentless versus?
I mean, those are the two biggest advantages of agentless, and I don't want to spend too much time on this topic because I know we're talking a little bit about serverless. But it's really about visibility, and it's about ease of onboarding and ease of use. Right? You avoid that. We always use the term alert fatigue, and we'll probably deal with that a little bit later in another question. But there truly is alert fatigue with agents. So it's like, in the end of the day, it's like any task, like, oh, hey, who's going to maintain the agents? Hey, Tom, hey, Jill, can you load up some agents on those new machines? Okay, well, they're busy. We'll get to it. We'll have them up for you in a couple of days. But what if you don't have to deal with that? With agentless, you don't need anyone to load up the agent, so you don't have that friction potentially between who needs to maintain the agents, and it may not be the security teams doing that. Just think of it as, you can almost think of it as not quite the same thing, but just automatically having an agent on every machine without having to worry about the maintenance of it, right? Not quite the same technology, but it's almost, the ease of use part is like that. It's like, okay, no one's got to do it. It's there, it's done. We can move on, and we can worry about getting our reports and our data so we can get to business of security.
So John, you mentioned relationships earlier, and then you mentioned alerting, which cues me into going to the next data point. Those are the magic words that we didn't discuss, but sort of nicely takes us to the next data point, which is, how does your team generally view security alerts? And we ask folks, do you ignore them? Do you assume false positive, race to fight the fire, or do you place them in an organized queue? And my takeaway from this is that the majority of companies, about 2/3, are running around with their hair on fire, or they're putting their head in the sand because there's alert fatigue. They get alerts, but running down the different causes of those is difficult or nearly impossible. Also, sometimes the alerts, you really need the most senior and most skilled security folks and operations folks to figure it out. And those people need to be focused on more strategic things. But a more junior employee might have, unless they have technology to help them, the alerts are sort of meaningless to them because they don't know, they don't have the proper context to understand the relationships. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about two things: risk prioritization and context. When I talk about this question, and you're kind of right. I just don't like, I don't want to say people are putting their heads in the sand, but they're looking for a better way, right? So there's 1/3 of the people that are, and this is a really nascent industry. It only maybe, I want to say the big push for risk prioritization maybe only started about maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and it was very nascent. And then now it's a big push. Now, like every vendor is trying to do it, but it's not an easy problem to solve. And it could have been solved a long, long time ago if it was easy to solve. And there's different approaches, but I think one of the things, you have to really have a strategy around solving the problem. But another thing is what we call having a universal or a unified data model. So one thing, like if a company can kind of start and just say, we're going to build context and risk prioritization from the ground up, you at a certain point you can have a one data model and work it that way. Now, as you grow, you have to be really careful, because all of a sudden your one data model is you're gonna have a couple little data models sitting off to the side. But we've had, Orca's kind of had that advantage of it. But the other thing too is once you have good risk prioritization, you really can start solving that problem of alert fatigue, right? Once people start trusting the data, you have a lot of context around it. And a good way of like seeing it in a product is like going to an alert or an issue or whatever you want to call it, and seeing how much data do you have around it, how easy it is to drill down and to explore things, right? Do you have like a map to kind of show you, hey, where is this asset and how does it relate to other assets? And you can just click on things and you can go, and you can easily see things that are like tagged, like, okay, yep, this alert, the alert is usually a vuln or some kind of vuln. This asset, is it internet facing, right? Or is there a patch or a mitigation available for that risk, right? So things like that you can immediately see, and a lot of indicators, around how risky it is. So that context, like you said before, is really important. And that kind of, so once you start seeing that this is, and it's coming, it's not just any one company. There's some companies like Orca that have started getting a really good solution. Where we're really good is actually an environmental context. We know how things relate to each other, and we're starting to build on the other approach is additive, which is taking a look at threats. And we've started to looking at threat data and kind of augmenting that onto risk data. So it's a hard problem to solve, but it's getting solved by different people. And it really will, once you can kind of have that list that, you might have, 2,000 alerts, right? That you have to work with, but you only have to deal with a couple hundred. I mean, that really helps, or prioritize the couple hundred that you need to deal. That kind of helps really deal with that alert fatigue.
Yeah, and so some of that, a term I like is augmented intelligence, and so some of that is, your human staff is very good at, understanding context, and that might have happened 3 weeks ago or 3 years ago. I know how to fix it, although that's hard to document. So when that employee leaves, you lose that knowledge. But the machines are really good at ingesting huge amounts of data, never forgetting the data, making connections. And so, that's my view on sort of building that big corpus of data is important, because then you can help, teams work better and smarter, and use automation, machine learning to understand the context of alerts.
Yeah. And it starts, like, I like to use the word automation, because it starts, once you have, the more data you have, the more sure you are about something, the less likely it's a false positive. So you can start, auto remediation can be done for certain things. You have to be careful about what you use auto remediation for, but auto ticketing starts getting a real into play, where, even before, when you have data, you want to triage it first. You want a human to look at it real quick, at least, to say, okay, do we want to put it in the fix queue? But now certain things, if you have a lot of data and a lot of context around it, you can be very sure, this is a very likely, 99% is not a false positive, and you can auto ticket. And once you get even more trust in the systems, you can even start auto remediating certain things.
And then adding that context is really important. Maybe some of the large banks say we have all the staff we need, but everyone is starved for talent and skills. So giving that context, I think, is really important. Also, giving like a SOC analyst one, the ability to answer alerts that maybe a more senior analyst would normally do. But if you're able to give them the context around an alert and some level of confidence, then they can start doing the work of a more senior person.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's like, you're right. The machine do all this work saves humans time, and especially, you're right, it allows people that may not have enough experience to go see. They see all this data that's all interrelated, and they don't have to go make this association themselves, right? So there's a big benefit there, definitely.
Yeah, and it also probably helps with like everyone being on the same page in terms of conversations. All these different like the logs from different serverless technologies and different clouds all look different, and normalizing that so that you can have a coherent conversation is sometimes difficult.
Yeah, definitely. So let's see if I have anything else. The other thing has to do with alert fatigue is again being able to kind of get these visualizations. So one of the cool things that we kind of started adding, we're adding more and more threat data, but we started adding MITRE attack labels to our stuff. So we take a risk, and if a MITRE attack, usually it's a tactic, applies to a risk, we'll label it with that tag. And what's kind of cool about that is you can start making associations. You can start interlinking risks together. We even have a feature called attack path analysis, where you can sometimes go all the way from attack chain. So if you can find like an initial access risk and then there's certain risks that go after that. It always has to be an initial access thing first, and then you can have things like privilege escalation or lateral movement, finally going into your element of compromise, whatever that, there might be keys or data. And if we do that, we can do a little chain. And the cool thing is it's better risk prioritization, but also the cool thing about a chain, if you have 5 elements, if you're pressed for time, you only have to get rid of the most critical or easiest to fix element first to break the chain, and you can move on. So you've got a lot of flexibility on your prioritization and how you work that way. Just more data. You're right. More context, right?
Well, then the speed is also important. I was talking to a journalist yesterday or the day before about a emerging ransomware attack called quantum ransomware.
Okay.
And the way that it's executed is at the time of the breach until the victim's files are fully encrypted is under 4 hours. And, they launch it on the weekend. These cyber criminal gangs are smart. So, okay, here's a holiday weekend or at night or a popular vacation time. So, and obviously the security team isn't all at the beach, but they need to act really quickly. So having that, and they don't have time to, create a red team and go after this threat. Someone's got to stop the chain of attack right away and interrupt it. So it's that need for speed and visibility is increasingly more important.
Yeah. And that's where the context helps you in too, right? It's not just about a matter of what to work on, but you're right. It's actually sometimes faster to work on a particular item because you have more data and you can resolve that faster. You can make a decision, whether it's really important, in the triage process, or it also helps, the data also helps you in the remediation phase, because all that data can get sent over to a ticketing system, or you can see it in whatever the vendor's dashboard. And the more data you have about something, sometimes the easier it is to fix it, right?
Well, it's fixing it, and then it's also making sure it doesn't happen again.
Yes, yeah.
Everyone is going. Unfortunately, is going to have some sort of. I don't want to say they're going to be breached, but they're going to have a security event, and so to make sure that doesn't happen a second time is critically important.
Yeah, exactly.
So definitely, forensics is a big, you got to stop the event, but then figuring out, the forensics of it is,
yes.
And that's what the board is going to ask, the CISO.
That's another interesting area that you mentioned, the word forensics. I used to deal with computer forensics when I was in the military, but this is a new trend with the cloud, right? One of the cool things, the cloud is complicated, right? You have a visibility problem, but one of the cool things about the cloud is you can get at a lot of the data. Once you start making these relationships, you're going to start seeing products that are able to take that data, so you can actually do investigation much easier in the cloud. So once you see something, you can actually do investigation, so you're starting to delve into that. That's getting trendy right now with a lot of these terms, but I just want to call it incident response. But we have all the XDR, et cetera, kind of terms, but we're starting to get into that capability is really expanding fast in the cloud as well.
Yeah, I also think we're at a point in terms of analytics and machine learning where the packaged offerings from various vendors, Orca and other vendors, have matured to a point where they're really helping companies do what they need to do, rather than it's easier to spot these emerging threats. It's easier to do the forensics. It's easier to get the visibility. You don't have to build it yourself. So all of this is sort of becoming easier. Let's move. We've talked a lot about some of the challenges to the cloud, but and the cloud security. But one question we asked is, what's your biggest pain point with cloud security? And my initial reaction to this is, all right, it's interesting that application visibility is so low, but everything else is pretty much the same. And I think it comes down to, so people said data visibility or heterogeneous platforms, but what it really is it's the cloud and serverless is difficult. We've got different systems with different ways of reporting. You still have your on-prem, obviously if you're born on the cloud and you're always going to be in the cloud, that's different, but most organizations have some sort of on-prem infrastructure and data and workloads. So it's really complicated. So there's a variety of pain points depending where you are in your maturity.
Right. Yeah, this is this is kind of an interesting slide. The first thing that kind of pulls out to me is that data visibility is higher than applications visibility. So it would have. I think what we're really seeing is that people really care about visibility, but if you had to rank the two, I think people care more about data visibility than applications visibility. That's kind of the way I read it. But you're right. That's not so important in the overall message of the slide. Is like at the end of the day, you're seeing that the cloud is complicated, right? And you've got a lot of fundamental issues. One of them being visibility. And that's the good news is that it's a complicated problem, but it's a solvable problem in the cloud because you can get at all the cloud resources if you have a system that understands them fairly easy. So I'll let you go in a little bit, and then this is also a nice slide to talk about a lot of different things and tie them together. So I'll do that in a bit and just let you comment a little bit more on this.
Yeah. So I think the title of I think this addresses the title of the webinar. So visibility across clouds is it a myth? And so all of these problems come down to visibility. So if you a lot of teams are using multiple. If you going with one cloud, you've got multiple instances of that cloud. If you've got multi-cloud, you got multiple instances, most likely of multiple clouds. And so understanding, I think data visibility is the highest because understanding where your data is critically important. Even those born on the cloud companies, but they all have customer data on individual laptops somewhere in the field or at someone's work from home house. So understanding where your data is really important in terms of PII, GDPR, emerging private U.S. privacy requirements. So I think it all comes down to this idea of visibility. Understanding where all your assets are, and then visibility. Once you have visibility, it helps you approach compliance, risk, security, costs. I mean, the cloud is expensive and the billing is complicated. But if you don't have visibility, you don't even know, this cloud instance is really important. It runs our customer-facing mobile app. This cloud instance is used for experimentation. It runs all the time. It shouldn't be running all the time, and it's a big cost. So, so the bottom line is that I see is visibility. Sort of connecting all these.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of interconnection points. Yeah, and I'll start talking about my four things on this slide, right? There's a solvable problem, but you hit it right on the head with context, right? So, at the end of the day, visibility is only one of the things. You have to, context is related, right? So you can't have one without the other, or if you have one, it's not that useful. If you just have visibility and you can't, okay, you can see everything. Well, if you don't have good context, it's not very valuable, right? Obviously. So that's kind of like our two big strategic prongs, right? At Orca, it's like, and we use the word context a lot as well, but ultimately the goal there is risk prioritization. So the main goal. So we got visibility. We don't want, it's really bad to have gaps, right? You don't want to have a machine that you don't know about, or you're not scanning, you're not detecting risks on, right? You want to solve that visibility problem. But once you do, wouldn't it be great to be able to interlink all these different things, and not just interlink the risks from a standpoint that they're linked, but we didn't really talk about this too much. We call it, at Orca, we call it multi-tool, but it's the ability to do different things and be able to combine risks. So, example is vulnerability management and configuration management, and they're linked, right? So, the fact that you have a vulnerability on something, let's say it's ranked with a CVSS score of 9.8 or something, right? Or even 10. That's still okay. Well, you've got something that's ranked really critical, but that's a static score. Do you really know the context around it? So there's a configuration thing, is if you have like an open port on the machine, or unsecured port on the machine, or is it internet facing, or is there an exploit available for that vulnerability? There's all this context that helps you prioritize risk. And also, like you said, you made a good point on the previous slide, it helps you remediate that risk, right? So those are intricately tied together, those two things.
Yeah. So one of the questions that came in the Q&A area is, how do you add that context? Is that data that Orca has? Is it third-party risk threat data? All of the above?
We do about 8 things at Orca, right? So what Orca does is, if you really deal with Orca, is we have these things that are called risk types or threat types. Threat types is probably not the best word for it, but we combine risks together. So we have the classic vulnerability, and you have CV, whatever, you have that kind of stuff. But then we have certain things, like a good example is our lateral movement risks. We have a risk type called lateral movement. And there's certain things that have to happen for lateral movement. They're usually a combination of 3 things. Like, do you have a secret available that's accessible? Do you have a certain kind of vulnerability? And those certain things combine to make a slightly more kind of a complicated form of risk. And the nice thing too is it's very detailed. Once you read it, it's like, and it shows all the data artifacts about it. Like, oh, okay, your keys are here and this and that. It's everything's a nice one little bundle. But that's how we do it. We combine things together and build risk type. I call it risk types, and it's one way of solving the problem. And to do that, it's you have to think about the problem. You have to work to solve the problem. But you also you don't have to have a universal data model, but it's easier if you can get all the data at one place rather than have 3, pieces of software communicating via JSON or XML or something. It's like, okay, all the data is in one thing, so we can make we can do these combinations and check them real easily.
So the universal data model, where does that make? Sometimes people say, oh, that's a data lake. That's going to be a big
It really is having everything in one database, right? With one schema. So all your vuln data, everything. It's not just, okay, I've got my vuln database and I've got my configuration database, but they're probably in different data. I don't want to get into database architecture, but essentially it's in one database where you can get at everything easily, rather than it. If you've really thought about the problem, and I've thought about it a lot, I used to work in product management a little bit, but if you have 2 pieces of software, let's say a company acquires, has built-in technology, and they acquire something else, well, it's complicated initially, because initially you just have the 2 programs have to just talk to each other and send data to each other. That's the first step, and then you can start building. But it takes time to get these 2 programs well integrated. It's not an easy task. So that's what we mean by universal or unified data model.
Got it. All right. So any you want to share? We've talked a little bit about Orca, but do you want to share sort of a little bit more about Orca and how you guys are breaking the myth of the ability to get visibility across different clouds and across environments?
Yeah. So as we touched on in this presentation, the cloud is complex, but we try to solve it in a variety of different ways. And I'll kind of go over a little bit, but we're all about like being faster, simpler, cloud security, right? And the speed, one of the speed piece of it, or the maintenance piece of it, is that we're agentless. So the nice thing about not using agents is you don't have to install or maintain agents. So you can actually have a faster onboarding time and ease that maintenance burden. Then a couple other tenets that we have is we are totally subscribed to being multi-tool and multi-cloud. Multi-tool just means we do a lot of things, right? It's if you don't, then you've got to buy 3 or 4 platforms to do everything. So we try to be pretty all inclusive on the important things that relate to cloud infrastructure security. Multi-cloud, we're subscribed to that from the beginning. Right now, we're adding Alibaba Cloud really soon, which will be, but right now, AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, we are committed. Every feature is committed to being on every platform. Because sometimes what happens is you'll get a company that claims to be multi-cloud, and they'll have coverage, but then it'll be like, hey, wait, you're missing these things on let's say Google Cloud. And sometimes we have a little bit of a lag, but it's very minimal. We might have a feature that's not on all 3, but we really prioritize getting it on, having all 3 covered, and then adding a 4th platform, we'll do the same thing, right? And adding more clouds will make it more valuable. And then the final thing is that we are all about risk prioritization and stuff. We talked a lot about that. It's having that unified data model, building it from ground up, combining these risks, building all that context. One other thing that we do is we provide, and we touched upon it briefly, we provide a lot of data. When you see an alert or an issue or whatever, a specific or an asset, you see you can drill down to almost anything about that asset, what ports are open, you can see it all. So it makes for a really good investigative tool as well, being able to have that data. Or like you said, Dan, having that data just to be able to make better decisions. So those are some of the advantages and some of the tenets about what Orca is about in solving the cloud security problem.
Yeah, and I think it hits on a few different things that stand out to me. One is, there's not a single chief security officer or CFO for that matter that wants to pay for more tools. Mm-hmm. So supporting a number of different tools is important because it's hard to manage, it's expensive. We talked about the idea of connecting data between tools. So if you've got multiple tools and you're mm-hmm. It's very difficult to and a lot of times those tools end up sitting on the shelf because it's
right. They're not. It's right. That's a good point. We're not in the different industry. We do a little bit of a shift left, but we're not. The shift going into the DevOps kind of shift left side is even more complicated because there's more kinds of tools, more kinds of things you can do in the development stage, and that is a hard problem that I haven't quite seen any solutions keep getting better and better. But just give an example, there's different ways of looking at code, and it actually there's benefits of looking at code different ways. And how do you aggregate and correlate that data so that then you have everything? Oh, okay, this tool that uses this kind of method is saying this, and if 3 tools that are using 3 different methods are kind of saying, hey, this module of code's got a problem. Well, you're really, you pretty much know you have a problem, and you have a lot more data to deal with, to look at and figure out what the problem is, right? So yeah, that's a little bit of a problem. Cloud is hard enough, but solving the aggregation correlation problem in the development space is even tougher.
Yeah, and then the other thing you mentioned is, and we've talked about it a bunch, but this context is so important because it allows people to work smarter, to be more independent. It also helps new employees, whether they're just out of school or whether they're coming from another organization. It gives them an easier on ramp. It's not there's a lot of employee fatigue, and if everything you got to you have no context, and you're told you got to run down these alerts, it's a pain, and you might have a hard time keeping people if you don't give them the tools that can give them insight into what they're chasing.
Yeah, multi-cloud's an interesting with that, because I'm not super, my most of my background a little bit is working with AWS, but I usually find is like somebody's really good at AWS, somebody's really good at Azure, somebody's really good at Google Cloud. You hardly ever find somebody who's good at really good at two platforms. So having a tool where you can translate stuff from one to another and work in the same way is really beneficial when you're doing multi-cloud. And it helps you learn. You're right, that you're making a really good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then also it's almost like a tribal thing, that employee who loves AWS, she or he is going to never listen to the person who's Azure.
Yeah. That's a good point too.
Never going to meet, and which is okay. It's like Android and iOS.
Yeah.
Never going to meet. But having a common data set allows you to bring the data together and normalize it without everyone needing to be an expert on every platform, because it's too difficult. And there are experts on every platform, but companies can't afford them because they're so senior and have huge compensation.
And what's really common too is a lot of companies will take one of the cloud service providers and they'll only use another one for like 10 or 20% of their work. And kind of a backup, right? In case something happens. So do you want to spend a lot of energy on that one platform, the 20%? A lot of people kind of don't want to. So the easier you can make that transition, the better.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
So before I hand it back to Cody, any final thoughts?
That's pretty much it. I think just to, if you want to sum up a little bit about what we covered a little bit in the webinar, but the abstract was definitely about cloud visibility and cloud security in relation to visibility. And I just wanted to comment. I thought you guys did a great job with the pulse meter, with the questions. And I thought that it was nice to just be able to base stuff on the answers of actual people live and doing it. So really appreciate it, Dan.
Thanks, John. And I think our audience is really interested in serverless. I was actually surprised, and that shows why we had a large amount of responses to the polls. I was frankly surprised that such a huge number of folks are either doing serverless now or have it on their roadmap. I mean, rarely get data points that are over 80%. It was 86% are either doing serverless or it's on their roadmap, which is surprising because in this day and age, I would say 86% is basically everyone. So I thought that was interesting. We talked about alert fatigue, and sort of the way of solving some of that is giving context. So if it's a false positive, if there's not a lot of, if there's reason. And it was interesting when you talked about giving context in terms of different types of threats. Red flags are going to go up for certain types of threats. Others you sort of, we'll get to it when we get to it. But there's certain threats that you need your most senior folks to focus on that right now.
Right.
And that's what's really important. And then, the idea of visibility, I think it really comes down to getting data from these different platforms and getting insight into the data.
Yeah, I think I'll just do my last comment pretty much. But one of the good examples of visibility too, sometimes when you really need it, we all talk about Log4j, but Log4j was a tricky vulnerability if you remember, because the vulnerability could be nested inside these different jar archive files. So it wasn't like if you just scanned the initial case, you'd be picking up the parent case, but you wouldn't be picking up these kind of hidden ones. So we actually we don't do it for everything, but like anything that's critical, we actually went and wrote specialized scanning code to go look and nest in the jars. But that was good. Okay, we can go look at nested jars, and some other companies did the same thing. But the fact that we have 100% visibility into the cloud, every machine we see, whether it's stopped, paused, active, you're pretty much assured that we're picking up everything, right? So that was a lot of customers really like that kind of thing, when it really counted too as well with something like Log4j. And it's like, okay, I got 100% visibility. I know every place, maybe it's going to be a little bit harder to fix, right? But I know where everything is, right?
Well, that's a huge issue. It's sort of the digital supply chain, your software supply chain. There's a good, with the proliferation of open source, there's a good chance you don't even know what types of open source offerings are built into your software. And that was, I think Log4j really brought the idea that you don't know that you have this vulnerability because the development teams are using tools that are available to them, but they're not. No one's really keeping a list of, you're not documenting like you once did.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
All right. Any last thoughts? I think I'm.
I think that's it. I think.
Yeah, this was a great conversation, John. Let me hand it back over to Cody.
Okay. Thanks, Dan.
Well, thank you, John and Dan, for taking the time to be with us today. I'd like to take a moment to remind our audience that the session was recorded. You should be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand, but you can also find this living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and be sure to look in the on-demand section. It should be there within the next 12 to 24 hours. So we do have these four $25 Amazon gift cards to give away. Our first winner is Chloe W. Our second winner is Okoro O. Our third winner is Stella N. And our fourth and final winner is Larry D. So congratulations to the four of you. Please keep an eye on your inbox to claim your gift card. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. I'd like to thank Techstrong Research for performing the surveys and putting together this Pulse Meter report. And I'd like to thank Orca Security for sponsoring this webinar. And my final thanks, as always, will go to you, our audience. We really appreciate you spending time with us. We ask for one extra moment of your time to fill out a quick post-webinar survey, but otherwise, we do hope to see you at an upcoming Techstrong Learning webinar. Everyone have a great rest of your day. And Dan and John, thank you again.
Thanks.
Great, thanks.